Why was the Northeast ignored for so long?
Now, there are two reasons for it. Number one, the way geographically the Northeast has been mapped out. If you look at the map, you have the mainland here, and then you have a 22-kilometer road that connects the Siliguri corridor or the Chicken's Neck that we call it, that connects it to the Northeast. 22 kilometers. Who thought of it? Because it connects our most important region to the rest of the country. It can be, if there are bad intentions, it can be cut off at any given point of time. How long is a 22-kilometer width road going to take? What that also does is makes your accessibility less, right? Train lines, flights, or even road travel, having good roads. But the other problem is that we had a policy of isolation and exclusion. Till this dispensation came in, the idea was right from post-independence that, keep this separate, keep it less developed. Because if it's less developed, we'll have less threat from China. This made no sense whatsoever. That don't build roads. Let complete authority be with local leaders, as it should be. But eventually, this is a nation. We need that kind of interaction. We need that kind of engagement with the central government. But here they'd become like little fiefdoms, the governments. It was dynastic politics in the Northeast as well. And that in the changing global scenario doesn't really work out. But let me go one step further. The dispensations post-independence were following colonial policies. So we didn't even change the policies that the British applied on the Northeast after we gained independence.
Were these policies of the British also kind of separating the Northeast from the rest of the country?
It actually was, and it is shocking, Ranveer.
Is it because of this whole divide and rule angle again?
Yes,
Okay.
and it's shocking because the British came into the Northeast much later, because again, it was very far away and this and that. So after they won the Battle of Plassey, I think it was in Bengal, I think 1757, that's when they really set their eyes on the Northeast. And as usual, kingdoms there were having internal conflicts. The Burmese were invading India very often on the Northeastern, so we had the First Anglo-Burmese War, we had the Second Anglo-Burmese War. I think the first one was 1824 to 1826, and so on and so forth. We had three Anglo-Burmese War. Now, they asked the British to come and defend them.
The kingdoms at the border.
Yeah, like the Assamese, the Manipuris, So once they did that, obviously they'd cemented their hold. They managed to put their favored person on the throne. And the British were always very astute businessmen. So they had already known about China being at the frontier, Myanmar being there. There was a big trade war to do with tea that was going on. So tea was being manufactured in China, but the British also wanted a stake. This was also the time, Ranveer, when they were wanting to colonize and wanting to trade. Now, it needed shipbuilding. Shipbuilding needed timber. Myanmar, Northeast was full of it. These were great, like very rich grounds for them. Also, they realized that it has minerals. These are rich areas. So these were many of the reasons that they got very excited about the Northeast. However, the Northeastern populations are hugely territorial. Territorial integrity is hugely important to them. They're also extremely, Ranveer, they have a lot of pride. Tribal communities, and it's largely tribal communities. Tribal communities are very attached to their land. They're very attached to their own administrative systems.
Rules.
Yeah, means there are rules that all old civilizations come up, which is best suited to them. Suddenly the British come and they apply rules. They weren't going to take it lightly. So there were many uprisings against them, this, that. The British realized a lot of the tribes, including the Naga tribes, they couldn't control. Now, every time they would try to move on their trade routes in the northeast, these guys would come raiding. There were some massacres. There was raids, and they'd finish off their contingent and go back. They couldn't do anything because they weren't being able to handle them. So they created what was called the inner line regulation, which we still have. Inner line regulation meant that they could not come out of a certain boundary area that they'd pulled. Then there was the excluded, included areas. These were excluded areas. So they wouldn't have the same development that the rest of the country had. So there was like this policy of non-interference with them. The Congress, Indian National Congress in 1936, Ranveer said, this is really bad. You can't divide our communities like this, because if they don't get the same development that the rest of the country will, at some point they will, they'll resent it and they will not have the same opportunities that we do. We have to find a way to integrate them. And obviously that wasn't in the favor of the British. So they kept these policies. So inner line permit meant that, for example, the Nagas could not come out of that line that was drawn. And, people like you and me from the rest of the country could not go in. However, there was also another angle to this. They said we have to tame them. See, the idea of tribal is very alien to us. For the British, it was wild populations. They needed to be tamed, So then they brought in religion as well. So Nagaland, as a matter of fact, missionaries could go in, but sadhus couldn't. So these were many, many reasons why policy-wise, these areas became divided.
So a lot of the modern day Northeast issues actually began with the British.
Exactly.
They were kind of also at the receiving end of lack of policy making by the governments right after independence, which is the Nehru government.
Absolutely. So first, it was the British. They were all self-ruling and there were kingdoms and they had their own ways of interacting with each other. Some tribes were very independent. They would pay tax to, let's say, the king of Assam and, so on and so forth. But they had their own way of figuring things out. The British come in, they bring in these new policies, right? They also interfered a lot with their social structures, so creating either umbrella identities or fragmented identities. या तो identity जो थी उसको तोड़ दिया, या तो एक ऐसा umbrella identity बना दिया that suddenly there were groups who felt like, we are one and we are on the side of the British, and like you said, unfortunately, post-independence, we didn't relook at this because Nehru's tribal affairs advisor was a missionary called Verrier Elvin, who was a white man. So again, this is about perspectives. My perspective will not be the same as somebody who's born, brought up in the West, and their perspective may not be the same as mine.
Sure. But you said that they didn't want to develop the Northeast because it would attract attention from China.
This was post-independence.
What's the logic behind this?
That, if there isn't infrastructure, there's no logic behind it. A lot of things are completely illogical. But if there's no roads, there's no sort of way of getting in, there isn't any industry, unko kya hi milega wahan?
It won't be attractive enough for
It
China?
won't be attractive enough. It's a very flimsy policy mistake. But I'll tell you something. The fact is that nobody wanted to have a focus on the Northeast. It was too far out. Everybody was too focused on Jammu and Kashmir. Our western frontier has taken up our entire, imagination. One of the reasons that has happened is, there's Western interest in that Western frontier as well. But the northeastern frontier is just like, for example, the border with India and Myanmar is 1,643 kilometers of porous border. We have borders with Bangladesh, we have sea borders. It's a huge, huge, massive border. Attention should be there. Jammu, Kashmir to sambhal liya hai, and even earlier on, there was a lot of focus, a lot of academic interest, scholarship, military interest, international vested interest. Who's ever heard of the Northeast frontier? Anybody being interested in? They used to call whatever happened that side, they used to call it the Great Game West. Now they're calling this area the Great Game East.
Yeah. Also, I've only been to Guwahati, but I've been there in the winter where the sun sets at 4 p.m.
Yeah.
And I know that there's an argument that a lot of people from the Northeast make that they need a separate time zone. And I'm fully in favor of that argument because I feel it does affect productivity.
Yeah.
Now, the thing is, this is a very everyday life anecdote. So I can't imagine what else people of the Northeast, generally speaking, are going through. And I understand why they would feel ignored. All we can do as media professionals is take steps in the right direction and talk about the Northeast more, at least. Because I promise you, and I hate saying this to everyone watching this from the Northeast, but the rest of India doesn't know much about you. Because the media has not spoken about you guys enough. And I think this is a step in the right direction. So irrespective of who's talking about it, at least we're moving, towards
Absolutely.
learning.
And that should be appreciated. And I'll tell you, it's a two-way thing. If we didn't speak a lot about them, and if there was this sort of, I'd even go as far as to say there used to be this underlying discrimination, right? Even when I went there, their names were outsiders from them also, because there was a distance that was created.
There is racism in the Indian metros towards people from the Northeast.
There's racism, and again, that's a new civilizational lens that has come about because Indian civilization didn't have an idea about race. If it did, for example, if we had any idea about race in our history, Rukmini is slated to be from Arunachal Pradesh, right? There's an entire, one of the bigger tribes consider themselves descendants of Rukmini and say that, Krishna Bhagwan came to get her there. Chitrangada is supposed to be from Manipur. Hidimba and Ghatotkacha's kingdom is supposed to be Dimapur in Nagaland. So what does that tell us? That race was not a part of our mental makeup. This has come later somewhere, just the way diversity was not alien to us. But today, when we talk about it, it's like, we need to, there's a uniqueness, which needs to be preserved. Of course, all uniqueness needs to be preserved. Everybody, I'm Gujarati, and I'm from a certain part of Gujarat. It has different cultural, ways of doing things than maybe another side of Gujarat, So everybody wants to preserve their cultural identity, but that doesn't mean you're separate from anyone else.
If you enjoyed today's clip, make sure you check out these curated playlists that we've made especially for you related to the subject that was spoken about in this clip.